Welcome and thanks for coming. I'd like to introduce Carl Malamud, who I've known now for more years than I suspect either of us could count. I'm proud to say that Carl is my kind of troublemaker. He's caused several interesting bits of trouble over the years, and he's here to tell us about more. So with that, Carl Malamud.
I guess I won't use the standard line, I'm from Washington and I'm here to help you. Actually, the line I use in Washington is I'm from the internet and I'm here to help you. I thought I would start and give you 10 minutes kind of a background just to kind of let you know where I'm coming from, and then talk about a new project that I've been putting together for about a year now. For most of the 80s, I did professional reference books and I consulted with the government. I actually started working for the Federal Reserve Board and did their research network in like about 82. About 1990, I kind of figured that DECnet and Novell and all that stuff just wasn't going to scale, and that this TCP/I thing might do the job. And I'd been on a kick of putting standards online. I just felt that if you're going to have a standard, it ought to be readable by people. And so I'd spent several years attacking, ITU and ANSI and ISO and, doing the OSI TCP/IP fight. And about 1990, I got an appointment with the Secretary General of the ITU. And I flew to Geneva and went and saw him and said, your standards ought to be online. And his answer was, we'd love to put them online, but, it's technically impossible because, you see, our standards that we do are published in a system that we developed in the 70s, and we lost the source code. It was a text formatting system. And I was like, well, maybe if you gave me some tapes, I could, do something with them, and I'd give you a copy back of your stuff in a more modern format. And we'd put it on this little research network, the internet. And that's kind of how he referred to the internet, as this little research network. And he figured, no harm, there's only a few people there. And so I went back to the University of Colorado with my friend Mike Schwartz, who did Harvest and stuff like that. And we printed out octal dumps of all their tapes. And then we took the ITU Blue Book and we spread it on the floor and we started looking. And we said, well, that looks like an E. That might be a paragraph mark. We wrote a little program and translated it from the old format that they had it in, which actually was using 3 different character sets, one of which they invented themselves. And we took this thing and we turned it into TROF, which was considered quite modern at the time. And we released it on the internet. 2 things happened. I got a call from the National Science Foundation saying, you're using up all our bandwidth on the international links because everybody's making copies of this thing. International links were 56 kilobits at the time. And a few weeks later, I got a letter from the Secretary General saying, well, thank you so much for the source code. We have decided to terminate the experiment. Please retrieve all copies. I was like, this is going to be hard because there's been a whole bunch made. I'll take my copy offline, and I did, and the 40 other mirrors were kind of there. And I wrote a book about it called Exploring the Internet, which kind of documented this ITU thing. And while I was doing it, I was traveling around the world meeting folks that were building the internet at the time, people like Paul Vixie and Jun Murai in Japan, and wrote a book about it. And that kind of brought me to the next phase of what I wanted to do, which is I decided to start a radio station on the internet. And this is about 93. Figured, what the hell, this won't be hard. We'll just put audio files online. So we started a program called Geek of the Week. And Geek of the Week ran for about a year. There's a point to this. I did this in Washington, D.C., and we figured, since we're doing Geek of the Week, we might as well do some more fun stuff. And so I went to the National Press Club and said, you got an extra broadcast booth. You got one for C-SPAN, you got one for National Public Radio. Could we have that extra one? And went to the governors and finally convinced them that we were allowed to put their stuff out live on the net. And as part of that, ended up looking at government archives in Washington. And I think I spent most of the last decade kind of working on this issue of putting government stuff online. So the radio station led to a little demo on the Hill. And when I was on the Hill, a congressman came up to me and he said, some Nader's Raiders sent me a letter and said the SEC Edgar database ought to be online. Why isn't it? I said, I don't know. I'll go look at it. And so I looked at it and I said, well, it doesn't look that hard. It could probably be done. And so I found myself in a meeting with the congressional staff and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And at which point I heard the same answer I'd heard from the ITU. It's like, why shouldn't we put this stuff online? It'd be technically impossible. So, well, come on, it can't be that hard. So we rigged up a little deal with the National Science Foundation in which we took money from American taxpayers, from the NSF, and we used it to buy the data from the SEC, American data, in order to give it back to people on the internet and run it for free, which we did for about 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, put a little sign up on the internet that said, this service will terminate in 60 days. Click here to send mail to Newt Gingrich, click here to send mail to Al Gore, click here to send mail to the chairman of the SEC. Now, he didn't have email at the time, and so we kind of did a proxy for him. We took all the email with about 15,000 protests, and we printed them out, walked them down to the SEC, and actually crashed one of their meetings and said, you know, this stuff ought to be online. At which point we finally got a meeting with kind of SEC management, and they're like, well, how much would this cost? Well, it cost us a couple $100,000 a year, it'll cost you $1 million. And they're like, okay, do people really use this stuff? It's like, well, yes. This is not a bunch of fat cat lawyers and financial types. These were senior citizens and journalists and students, and, you know, we were up to 70, 80,000 people a day using these SEC documents. And to the chairman's credit, he said, well, okay, we should be doing this, but unfortunately our internet connection isn't working, and I don't think we have a computer. They had a mainframe. And so we took a 4-processor Sun and put it in a station wagon and drove it down to the SEC and configured their T1 line for them and got them up and running, and that worked out real well. Now, the Patent Office, on the other hand, we had put the patent data online just to prove that the SEC stuff wasn't just like so simple, it was a no-brainer. So we put the patent data online, and unfortunately the patent commissioner decided that the patents were a source of revenue, not a way of promoting the useful arts and sciences by letting people know what these inventions were, but a revenue source. And so he refused. And so about 98, I sent a letter to Al Gore, which said, you know, this stuff really ought to be online. And, you know, if I didn't come right out and threaten, but basically the gist of the letter was within 60 days, if you guys don't decide to do this, we're going to do it. We're going to run it for 2 years, and then we're going to stop it. And so we started like mirroring the patent office, and I started making lots of calls to the patent office saying, well, you know, how much exactly was it cost for, you know, all of the data? And if I wanted 20 years worth, how much would that be, and when could you deliver it? And sure enough, on day 59, Commissioner Lehman went to the American Bar Association and explained that, you know, as part of the normal planning process they had been undergoing, they were going to be putting this data online. The point of this is that, you know, as an individual, you can actually change the way government does things. That is possible at times. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes they really don't want to do it, and they go kicking and screaming. But that's kind of the business I've been in for the last 10 years. So I'm going to tell you one more war story, and then we'll get to the topic at hand. I'm actually on a red-eye back this evening. At 6:30, I land at Dulles. I get in my car, go find my suit, and drive up to the Capitol to testify on the issue of the Smithsonian Showtime contract. I don't know if you guys have been reading about this, but the Smithsonian decided to cut a contract with Showtime, not release the contract, and the deal, as we understand it, is that if you want to make a film using the Smithsonian collections or access to staff, you have to give Showtime a right of first refusal. So I read an article on Boing Boing, which talked about an article in the New York Times that said Ken Burns was upset by this, and that the contract was secret and they were refusing to divulge it. So I thought, come on, you know, this is silly. So I sent a FOIA request in, and that kind of got me sucked into the middle of this little Smithsonian Showtime fight. The story gets worse. It turns out this contract is a 30-year contract signed this year. Now think about this. 30 years ago, 1976, if you had signed a 30-year contract for the future of things, 1976, there were about 200 computers on the internet. WTBS had just started going up to satellite. Cable industry was just starting to happen. C-SPAN didn't exist. And the next hot thing that was just about to happen was the fax machine. Faxes were big in Japan. They were just starting to happen in the US. So just imagine a 30-year contract in 76. We also found out through an anonymous tip to EFF, who was representing me in the FOIA suit, that, surprise, surprise, webmasters at the Smithsonian are being told to take audio and video off the public websites because it conflicts with the non-compete clause of the Showtime contract. So I've been called up to the Hill. They were going to do hearings with the secretary anyway, but they've decided that a public panel is in order. I got a pointer to my testimony, and there's a pointer to some other things that are out there. But I just wanted to give you a little context, kind of where I'm coming from. I'm from Washington, but I'm kind of from the outside part of Washington. I work for a think tank called the Center for American Progress, and we're kind of a liberal, nonpartisan, left-wing think tank. But I have to be careful. We're 501c3. So about a year and a half ago, when I got to Washington and joined the center, I got called in my boss by, who's John Podesta. He used to be Clinton's chief of staff. And he's like, you know, IPTV is really big. We should do something. What should we do? And I thought to myself, and this was last February, I guess, and I thought to myself, you know, there's something that's always really bugged me. And what bugs me is when you go to Washington and you go to a congressional hearing or you go to, you know, an executive agency briefing, you really need to be in Washington to observe the way our government works. Now, you know, there's some webcasting going on by a few congressional committees. There's some others, you know, there's some other things that are occasionally online. C-SPAN does a great job on the stuff they do, but, you know, they're 3 channels. They can only do so much. And there's probably 10 or 15 events happening every day in Washington. And there is no permanent archive. When I'm doing research and I want to go back and see a hearing, I want to see what so-and-so had to say about patents or about this or about that, that information has typically disappeared. It's just not there. So I started digging into, you know, how do you get access to hearings? There are stenographers. The video and the audio aren't there. Even with the stenographers, even with the transcripts, not all of those are available. There are proprietary services that make a lot of that available. Some of it shows up many months later from the Congress. But it's not like, gee, something interesting happened yesterday. I definitely will be able to find it by searching for it in Google. It's a hit or miss thing. So the way it works in Washington, if you are a congressional committee or executive briefings, you know, the Federal Communications Commission does hearings, Patent Office does them, all sorts of folks do these things. There's 2 ways you get your audio and video out. You do it yourself, and the way that typically works is a congressional committee gets their IT dude to buy a camera, and the IT dude goes to the back of the room and does the camera thing, nothing as sophisticated as Google Video. And then they go to some commercial webcasting company. And they stream it out, typically in real audio, real video. The other way you do it is you let the media do it for you. And there's some interesting things that have happened to the media market in Washington. It used to be if you were going to do a hearing live, what you did is you hired a satellite truck and you parked it out front. And then you ran your cables in and you hooked up your camera, and that's how you got your video out of the hearing rooms. Verizon has put together a service called the Audio Visual Operations Center, the AVOC. And they have fiber going out to most of these hearing rooms now. And so if you're major media, what you do is you go to the AVOC, and this is just a dedicated video over fiber switch. So this is using the SDI standard, 280 megabits per second, standard broadcast quality video on top of fiber, right? So it's not TCP/IP or anything like that. What you do is you lease one line, you lease a switch at AVOC, you lease a line out to the Capitol or the State Department or the White House or whatever you're trying to cover, you lease another line back to where you are, and then you tell the switch, connect those 2 things together, and you get your video. And this infrastructure is fairly extensive. And so if you're major media, that's what you do. There's a little wrinkle for the Congress, because the Congress has so many hearing rooms. The Correspondence Gallery has put together a fiber optic project. And so you don't actually lease fiber from the AVOC switch all the way to the hearing room. You run your fiber into the basement of the Capitol, and then you use the existing fiber infrastructure on the Hill to get back out to the various hearing rooms. Not all of them are wired now, but most of them are. So what I'm trying to put together is a little system that provides what I call the Washington Bridge. And the Washington Bridge is a gateway between the hearing rooms in Washington and either the real world or the internet, depending on who you're talking to. And the idea here is to get 16 of these rooms up and running, stream the data out live to the net, and archive it permanently. Now, there's a couple twists involved in this that make it interesting. To stream it out live to the net, what I'm looking at is what I call a wholesale retail model. So we get all this video coming in, and it's 280 megabits per second. And you probably don't want to feed 16 280 megabit per second streams out on the internet on the public peering infrastructure. But you can convert that stuff into either MPEG-2 at 50 megabits per second, which is really high quality stuff, or MPEG-4 even at 8 megabits per second. It's still pretty high quality stuff. And there's no reason why you can't take all these 16 streams, convert them to MPEG over TCP/IP, run it out to one of the large co-location facilities, such as Equinix or PAX, and make it available to people like Google Video, people like NBC, to any other folks that might want to take this data and do something with it. In your case, there's lots of stuff you'd probably do with it. And so this service is intended to provide the highest quality feeds we possibly can to folks like Google Video and NBC and the others. And also provide somewhat of a retail operation, if you will. And by retail, I don't mean charging money, but I mean direct service to end users. And the reason for doing that, instead of just relying on Google Video and NBC and everybody else to kind of provision this and do it properly, is because I'd like to view this system as somewhat of a research test bed, right? As something that we can do some interesting work on top of. So I'm working with some folks from Cisco that are very interested in, okay, how do we sign all these video streams to make sure that there's some authenticity in there if people change it? Some folks at Sun are very interested in automatic generation of metadata. You know, anything from speech to text, which, as you know, is a little iffy these days, to other things. You know, video scene identification. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. So how do you put something like this together and roll it out the door? What we're doing is I'm in the process of creating a new 501c3 nonprofit, and it's called the Public Memory Trust. And it has a mission of building public works projects on the internet. Project number 1 is a Washington Bridge. It's got a pretty simple business model, and it's the one that I've used all my life, which is try to get companies like Sun and Cisco to give me a boatload of hardware. And so I'm talking to both companies at pretty high levels. These are, you know, up at the executive committee level. They're very interested. Both companies have some really good engineers working with me. Cisco's easy because there's a whole bunch of really good routing people there, and they're very interested in this. Sun is easy as well because, you know, we're talking a lot of storage here. And in the long run, you know, we're asking Sun for a petabyte a disk. In the long run, I would like to see every library in the country have a petabyte a disk and a permanent archive of all congressional proceedings. But you got to get this stuff started. So the business model is part, you know, I won't say free hardware, but hardware donated by companies that want to see something like this happen for a variety of reasons, and part cash. And I'm talking to a variety of potential cash sponsors. I've also talked to the government printing office. And they're very interested in this. And I actually went to see Bruce James, who is the public printer of the United States, which is, you know, he's an appointee of the president, and he's actually the official service provider for all 3 branches of government. He does Congress, the judiciary, and the executive. And I said, you know, in the long run, you need to be doing this, right? This is your job. We're not going to be doing this forever. But we'd like to run it for 3 or 4 years and prove that it can happen. And I was actually surprised by the reception I got. And the reception was very positive. It was like, this is good. We're not going to be able to do this right away. You can run a lot faster than we can. This is a good thing. We'd like to support you. And so we kind of, how do you do this? Because you don't really want to start a nonprofit and immediately take a lot of government funding because there's a lot of strings attached. You know, they're going to want a full spec ahead of time. And so we came up with what I think is a great way of doing things, which is they have a fellows program in which some of their young, bright staff go out to the agencies for a year. And they've agreed to give us a GPO fellow, which is prepaid staff for us, free training for them, and most importantly, a linkage with the government. It's what they call a public-private partnership these days. And so that means we're going to have 2 routes to be able to walk into an agency or to the Congress and say, hi, we want to, like, you know, get our cameras in here and get this video online. One is to go in as media. The other is to simply go in as you know, somebody helping the agencies get up and running. And so that's the kind of 2 different paths that we're going to be able to go in on this thing. So it's a new project. You know, I'm here sort of talking about vaporware, but it's vaporware I've been working on for a year. I think it looks like this thing is going to happen. We're in the process of writing the articles of incorporation. I've had a lot of talks with a variety of people within Google. Eric Schmidt used to be on the board of directors of our radio station way back when, and Vince Cerf was also on my board of directors. And so I've kind of pitched the project to them, and they were like, well, yeah, this is interesting. Go talk to the engineers. And so I called Steve up and said, you know, can I do a tech talk? And that's what brings me here. So that's kind of the prepared part of what I'm talking about, but I really just wanted to see if you folks had some questions. There's some, you know, interesting tweaks on this, interesting research projects we can do. There's some feasibility questions, you know, how do you engineer this? It turns out doing data centers in Washington, D.C. these days is really hard. All the colos are really either at capacity or doing a bad job, one of the two. And so there's some real challenges in engineering something like this. But I haven't seen any showstoppers yet. This doesn't seem, at least technically, like a hard thing to do. Certainly for a 3 or 4 year kind of roll this out, make it work, and then try to get the government to take the service over and do it themselves the way they ought to be doing it. So that's the basic outline. If you look at my links, I have a copy of this slide available at public.resource.org/google.techtalk.html. And I've got my email address, carl@media.org. Feel free to send me email. You'll find at the bottom there's a link to the business plan, which is a very large PDF document and kind of goes over this in great detail, including the finances. Questions?
So, are there now cameras in most of those rooms hooked up to this fiber?
The question is, are there cameras already in the rooms? That's actually an interesting question. Some of the committees have feeds. Sometimes the media is already in there. It's spotty. And so our strategy is a threefold strategy. One is to find as many hearing rooms that already have cameras and put splitters on them with the permission of the committees and the agencies and take those feeds and run them out. So that's part one. Part two is to get credentials as real media. And I actually had credentials for Internet Talk Radio with the Congressional galleries. And so to get those credentials and be able to participate in the pool feed operation in which, you know, one camera is in there, but everybody gets a copy of it. And then the third strategy is to buy 10 of these $3,000 cameras that are now coming out and get our staff of 12 is what we project to be the staffing level with this operation, and send them in to mop up all the stuff that isn't there. And we're not going to be able to do the whole government, but I think we can do 16 simultaneous feeds using those three strategies. Other questions? Yes?
This being government, and there are more laws and unintended consequences there than anywhere else. Whose ox is this going to gore?
Whose ox is this going to gore is the question. That's an interesting question. You know, it's very hard for a congressman to be against transparency, at least on the record. You might think that GPO would not like this, Government Printing Office, because we're kind of going in and doing their job, and, you know, doing it as a freelance, nonprofit, independent operation. But they seem to be pretty good about this. Major media might not like this because right now, you know, it's pretty much major media that does at least the important coverage. And what's going to happen, I'm pretty sure, is we're going to be someplace that they aren't. And that means that they're going to have to get their video from us in order to cover the news, which they'll be able to do free. All this data, by the way, is free. We're not charging anybody for the feeds. We're funding the project on a whole basis. So that was pretty important to me that we not, you know, try to do a cost recovery, because then we'd end up negotiating with Verizon's IPTV group, and it just seemed way too difficult. Who else is... Major media might not like it because they may find end users going to Google Video instead of waiting for NBC for their nightly news. And I'm expecting a lot of people to start mashing up this stuff. You know, not everybody's going to look at the whole hearing and annotate it and, you know, intensively work with it. But I think there's enough bloggers out there and other folks that are going to take it, you know, find the relevant snippets, slap it out on wherever they're going to put it. And so I think there's great potential for like large viewership on at least snippets of these pieces. Yes? The question is, where are you going to get the metadata? That's actually a difficult one. For example, you really want transcriptions on these things if you're doing them properly, right? We're not going to have the staff or the budget to do that. And so there's really three techniques, I think, for doing metadata. One is we will do the best we can to, get as much in kind of a broadcast management framework, time, location, speakers, scan in any paperwork. Number two is we're going to do as much automated stuff as we can, and that's the research testbed kind of aspect of this. Number three is allowing the net to do as much annotation as possible, because I believe that there's people interested in anything you put online, particularly if it's the Congress or the executive branch, various interest groups. One idea is to try to marry XMPP, Jabber protocols to the video streams. I've been told that that's hard to do, but that's a possible approach. And there's actually a fourth answer to this, which is we're going to do the best we can. On the other hand, we're going to hand it over to folks like Google Video, assuming you want this data, and presumably you'll do a much better job than we will because you run a production operation. So I guess that's answer number 4. So the real answer is we'll do the best we can. We're hoping that the net will do intensive annotation and that a lot of the metadata will very quickly but over time accumulate, therefore allowing us to provide various search facilities and locate what we're looking for and things like that. A lot of people are counting on speech to text, but I'm not sure I'd bet the farm on that one yet. Question is, are we going to do anything to facilitate annotation? We're going to do everything we can with the staff of 12 and the people around us working on the project. The way we've structured this, like I said, is a 501c3, a public trust, and we're setting up what I call the Council of Public Engineers. I kind of like that name. And basically, each of the sponsors is throwing 3 people in. So Cisco's got a Cisco fellow, a distinguished engineer, and a team leader. Sun's got 3 really good people. One of the guys that did the honeycomb, storage architecture. And the hope is that by drawing on these advisors and, the staff and other volunteers and people interested, we'll be able to do something. But I don't want to wave my hands too much and say, gosh, we're going to, provide broadcast quality 16 channels a day. I mean, this could be 50 hours of video every day. That's likely to happen once we're up to speed. So, you got a question?
So, I've never been in a hearing room. If there are stenographers going, any chance of getting a real-time feed from there?
Question is, can we get a real-time feed from the stenographers? You bet I'm going to try. Typically, the stenographers there's 2 different kinds of stenographers. There are the ones that work for, one of the commercial services like FedNet that sell this stuff, right, to the lobbyists that need that real-time transcript right away. And then there's a stenographer for the agency or the committee that's keeping records. Typically what happens there is they do their stenography and then it goes off into the committee process and, 3 months or 6 months later it comes back out. I will certainly go to them and say, gee, if we got a copy of what you're doing, we could put it online, it'd be great. You would save on your webcasting charges. Because right now these committees go retail to the extent they do webcasting. I mean, they hire some streaming media company, and if they have a hit on their hands, it breaks their budget. And so I think our proposition is pretty attractive, which is we'll put your stuff out in high res as well as lower res transformations for people. And I think that's an attractive proposition. My hope is that, if we can convince one committee chairman that it's time to upgrade their cameras and make them decent instead of the $50 webcams, and that maybe they ought to give us a copy of the stenographer's stuff, I think every one of the other committees would immediately begin doing the same thing. And so it's a question of, can you convince the first couple that, gee, they would look a lot better if they bought better cameras, they would look a lot better if the metadata were immediately available. Stephen.
So I'm heartened by your mention of FedNet, because one of the themes in the ECHR stuff, the USPTO stuff, and Smithsonian stuff is taking an intermediary and eliminating or minimizing their influence over the information and how it's, the terms under which it's distributed.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, it initially seemed like there was no intermediary. But now that you mention one, what's their deal? What are
there's a couple questions in there. So how is this going to affect people like FedNet? The intermediaries are of two sorts. There's the specialized Washington insider intermediaries, or the I provide service to the committee on a commercial basis intermediaries. How's this going to affect their business model? I don't know. I don't care. It's probably not going to be good. The other intermediaries are major media, because that's the ones that are really going to be affected by this. Because right now, it's the lobbyists get that stuff real time, and then if NBC or C-SPAN decides it's worthy of your attention, then maybe it's available. Maybe it's available now, but it's gone in 30 days. And so I think this will really have an effect on the journalists and particularly the major media operations. I think it's going to have some effect on the congressional committees and the agencies, because, what's going to start happening is people are going to watch their stuff live. They're going to be commenting in Google Talk chat rooms live, and that means that the staff is going to have to monitor those chat rooms, and it's going to be a different dynamic. And one of my hopes is that we get that feedback cycle going right back into a lot of these hearings, so that if somebody says something silly, staffer gets email or looks on a chat room, leans over to the congressperson and says, that was wrong, and then the congressperson looks at the witness and says, well, as I understand it, what you said wasn't right. And so hopefully there'll be more of a feedback loop there. Question in the back? Hey.
So you've been very polite, and you've sort of said, gosh, I'd like to know what you guys are working on, what are the interesting things that might map up with this. So more ruthlessly, what's your fantasy scenario of what Google should do to help? We've got a bunch of people that really would like Google to do something useful. So what would be a couple of hard items that we could pitch in?
Well, there's a couple things. Vince Surface said he'd be happy to join the board of directors of this new... Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, what is my fantasy scenario about what Google, might do to help this project happen? So Vince Surface said he'd be happy to join the board of directors. He's a busy guy, but he's good. And I've worked with him in the past. I really like him. Steve Wolf would be joining from Cisco. He used to run the NSFNet program, and so we're looking at a pretty good board of directors here. There's this council of public engineers, so it'd be really nice if 3 people from Google, people like Stephen or others, said, gee, I'm happy to be an advisor to this project. Cash would also be nice.
In terms of product-related stuff,
Yes.
How should people be able to get, be able to search for what you're what can we do to help that?
The question is, what can Google do to help on the kind of product-related stuff? I think there's a few answers to that. I'm really impressed with not only the Google Talk team, but the Google Video team, and also your engineering expertise in building big nets and data centers and things like that. And I do think we'd get a lot of really good advice. I also think there's a lot of interesting things we can do on our data that you might not want to roll out in production right away. So it might be an interesting test bed. Again, my kind of fantasy idea of taking the XMPP stuff and marrying it with the video streaming, or if not XMPP, some other mechanism of allowing the net to do intensive annotation of the streams, not only as they occur, but also after the fact. Because I think one of the things you can do is stream live, but then if you're able to have that permanent archive for anybody to use, maybe somebody goes in a little bit later or a little bit later after that and adds more information, and the stuff becomes more useful over time. And so, really working with people is really what I'm looking for in my fantasy scenario, is that people get interested enough in this that they want to participate with us at the Public Memory Trust, but also that you folks are ingesting this video and that you find it useful for your own products. Question?
Is part of the project to provide a centralized annotation, kind of like a, Wikipedia type information, or is it more distributed in your?
The question is, do you have kind of a centralized annotation facility, or do you just let Google Video do one annotation? We do one, somebody else does one. I think that's a research question, because I'm not sure how I would do. It has to be distributed, right? I mean, you have to, certainly with XMPP, you have distributed servers. And so it's got to be distributed, particularly, you got institutional boundaries here. Is there a way of setting up a common URL scheme, common stamping of the data so we can know what we're talking about. Is there some stegography or watermarking or something we can do on there? And then is there some mechanism we can use that allows you to, create lots of value on the data, participate in a global whole, and still keep your business interests? And I think that's one of the things that we would want to work on. The core thing, streaming video out, I don't think is hard. There's some difficult engineering. We got to configure the routers right. We got to make sure we're peering properly. We've got the proper transit. We've picked the right formats. But I think this is all, straightforward. It's hard work, but straightforward. How do you add value on the data, particularly that much data, and particularly with potentially very large audiences, I think it's something we all struggle with. And that's one reason I'm attracted to this, because I wouldn't mind spending the next few years kind of, working on that stuff, because I think it would be interesting.
I'm going to disagree respectfully.
Okay.
It's, that video distribution is merely going to require hard work. And that's because I think that to get the penetration that you want, where you've got it such that there's an active feedback loop,
Mm-hmm.
I think that requires a sufficient number of viewers that you develop this community of people who are commenting and wanting to be heard by the staffer who's sitting and able to whisper in Congressman's ear to pardon the phrase, call bullshit on witness.
Yeah.
And that smells like multicast to me.
So Stephen's point is that the engineering on the video distribution is not necessarily a no-brainer. I think I agree with him, so let me clarify my previous comment. I think it's hard work, and one reason I think this is doable is because there are people like Stephen interested in this, people like Randy Bush, who does IIJ. Hank Kilmer and Andrew Partan actually helped me do the initial engineering on kind of the sample configs. Hank ran Sprint's backbone, and Andrew did UUNet, and then went and did Vario. And so I understand the routing issues are difficult and the bandwidth provisioning issues are difficult, but I think there is great interest among the routing people on solving this problem and doing it. And so it's an issue I'm less worried about because I know the caliber of the people that are interested in the problem.
Talking service providers, to what extent do you think that this content might be one of the things that brings multicast to a point where service providers actually want to deploy it?
Question is, would this make multicasting like something that people actually do? That would be great. Internet 2 is multicast enabled, and so it's kind of a no-brainer to feed it onto Internet 2, send it out there. That gets it out to all the universities. Now, whether they're multicast enabled inside of their campus networks, that's another story. But, the big ones pretty much are. That's actually pretty decent infrastructure. We've been going since, at least 1990 on the ISP should do multicast, and so far, at least, it hasn't happened, and I agree it's the proper way to distribute this kind of stuff. A lot of people do multicast, but then there's also kind of the streaming, people want to see it when they want instead of when it's actually there. There's some interesting protocols that dynamically build multicast tunnels to the edges that people like Juniper and Cisco have been working on. Which is a possibility, and some people think that might be a carrot and stick. The way this works is when you ask for a multicast address, instead of your whatever video player simply saying, oh, we don't have multicast, go away, you use a little plug-in on your PC. It goes to the router and says, I want this multicast address. The router uses Anycast to go to a central directory, then dynamically builds a tunnel. And so the theory here is that if enough people are going in and dynamically building tunnels over the ISP's backbone, at some point they say, okay, we'll do multicast. I'm a little skeptical that I've been, I did a lot of M-bone broadcasting, multicasting, whatever, and long ago, and I've been watching the multicast stuff, and it's been terribly frustrating that it hasn't moved into the core infrastructure. And, there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of the ops guys are just like, this is too difficult, it's too hard, I can't train people to, provision the routers properly. It would be great if this ended up being a carrot and a stick that helped move that along.
Have you guys given thought to some of the other distribution methods like peer-to-peer
I will certainly put the question is, have you looked at other distribution mechanisms like peer-to-peer? Certainly BitTorrent service on the entire archive is a no-brainer, right? That's like, just do it. I think there'll be a lot of other things that we can do as well. And yes, I would like to see that, particularly for the more popular things. You know, when something hits the blogosphere and everybody gets all concerned, I would like to figure out a way to get that stuff out really quickly to folks and to get the bigger stuff out there, because, you know, a lot of people are getting real frustrated with the, 240 by 340 stuff. And, the lines are getting faster and people are getting able to be able to digest bigger things. And people are getting smart enough that they're willing to say, well, start downloading now, I'll come back in the morning. And so it is possible to begin thinking about, gigabyte distribution of video, or, hopefully at some point in the future we can even start going up to the full res stuff. I do a lot of work on high def, which is, 160 gigabytes per hour uncompressed. And you can compress it down to 8 to 16 gigabytes per hour when you're doing a variety of compression techniques. But, ultimately, that's still a little too big for folks. And so, yeah, the peer-to-peer stuff is one way to get that stuff out there, at least in chunks, and get it out to people. Any other questions? Got one here, and then one here.
So how are you going to deal with, the simple logistics of when do a meeting start and things like that? Why is the camera pointed off at a weird angle? It seems like you need somebody to kind of to look at each feed at least for a minute when it starts, or things like this. Are you going to have enough staff to do that, or how do you envision that?
Question is, how do you do the basic quality control of making sure the camera is not pointed out the window? We're looking at 12 staff, an executive director, a facilities manager, 5 network engineers, 5 video engineers, and one of the job requirements is everybody needs to be able to run a camera. We're going to do some simple broadcast management stuff. I don't want to spend the big bucks on the, cable head-in, fancy stuff. But yeah, you're right. We are going to have to sit there and monitor. Now, the good news is Washington starts at 9 and stops at 5. And so I think it is possible to intensively monitor what you're doing and do a pretty good job on it. But people will be running fast. We're going to look for an executive director that understands that part of his or her job is going to be holding that camera a couple hours a day, in addition to the business planning and the board briefings and whatever else they do. Peter.
Does C-SPAN, are you involved with C-SPAN? Do they care what you're doing? Do they support it?
The question is C-SPAN supportive? C-SPAN has, I went and talked to them and said, here's what I'm thinking of doing. I don't want you to think this is competitive. And so I have met with the founding chairman. I've talked intensively with one of their executive vice presidents, their chief operating officer. They're extremely supportive. Whether they'll participate or not, I don't know, but they don't view this as competitive. One of the issues that they learned with the Washington Correspondents' Dinner and the Colbert speech is that a lot of people on the net think their stuff is public domain. Well, it isn't public domain, and they have very strong feelings about things like events being viewed in their entirety. They don't want people using their stuff for political ads. And so they view it as a very positive thing that there would be a large public domain archive of stuff that they can point people to. They also view this as a potential source of video because they only have so many bodies. They can only be in so many places. And like I said, no matter what you cover, there might be something happening in another room which ends up being newsworthy. And so I do think in the long run, major media is going to be forced to deal with this service because they're just not going to want to miss, in case something does happen. Yes?
Does your scope include the floor of the House and Senate or anything like that as well, or just committees?
Question is, does this include the floor of the House and Senate? The good news is the floor of the House and Senate is very easy to do. It's done by, basically by the Congress with C-SPAN acting as operator. That stuff is public domain. If you're a member of the gallery, you're able to do that. And like I said, I've previously had broadcast credentials with the gallery. I actually put the floor of the House and Senate audio online in '93, and we had a cool little search engine working on that. We had a guy from MIT come down and do speaker ID. Turned out it wasn't hard to do for the floor because there's a limited number of people. We brought in the Congressional record, coupled the speaker ID together with a little clever programming that he did. And so we actually had a Waze search engine where you could say, I want to hear all Democrats from Minnesota last week who spoke about the budget. And you would pull up the audio as well as the transcript. Now, the thing that I liked the most about this service was the negative query, which was show me all audio that does not have corresponding text, because congressmen are allowed to revise and extend their remarks. And often they'll go in and just like leave this stuff out of the congressional record. And with our search engine, you can actually find in one search all of those speeches. Showed that to some senators, and they were like, oh. That was Deb Roy who did that programming. He's now a professor at the Media Lab, but very, very good at and kind of, you know, audio and video processing techniques. He does some really cool stuff. So. Stephen.
So I feel like opening another can of worms.
Another can of worms.
Let's say you're successful.
Mm-hmm.
And you're successful sooner and in a more widespread way than you could even imagine standing here. And there's infrastructure to distribute video so that every broadband subscriber in America can watch whatever meeting they want to. Let's say further that this whole net neutrality thing falls in the favor of people who control those broadband lines being able to prioritize whatever they want. And let's further say that there's some truly interesting content coming out of Washington in the next couple of years, say an impeachment hearing, I don't know, and that's deemed to conflict with the internet release of Terminator 4. What happens?
I sue somebody. The question is, well, so what happens? We get a success disaster. This is great. Everybody loves our stuff. Somebody, Comcast, whoever, decides that the impeachment hearings are not as important as the imminent release of Terminator 4. What do we do? There's some real First Amendment issues right there. And, you know, the Congress is not going to be happy if their stuff is not reaching end users. I think that would certainly illustrate the net neutrality point pretty well. Now, on the other hand, as you know, net neutrality can be two different things. It can be, I'm going to cut off your video or your voice over IP or whatever because it's not my service and I'm selling my own. Or it can simply be, I will provision my service better than your service. And that's kind of the shades of gray issue there. If they cut off the impeachment hearings, I think there's a huge issue, and that's pretty simple. You know, you go to Boing Boing, you tell them what's happening, you write some letters to the Capitol, and let the machinery go into action. If it's degraded and theirs is a little better and your stuff isn't getting through, then I think it's a more difficult issue. That's a real issue with the net neutrality thing, is how do you legislate fairness? You know, it's a real tough thing because, as you know, Stephen, whenever you engineer a net, you're always making trade-offs. And the position you're getting out of the Comcast and the Verizons is, oh, well, you know, this is just reasonable, normal engineering we're doing. But what tends to happen is they go over the edge. They say, well, okay, just because we're doing a product, we're going to cut off all this other stuff. And then all of a sudden it becomes a real issue for folks. So, there's another follow-up on what if you have a success disaster. I hope that, you know, at some point, like I said, the Library of Congress and the libraries of the world have permanent archives, as does Google Video and a bunch of other people. I hope all these committees have got, you know, beautiful cameras and they're sending stuff out, and the government printing office has got some kind of a DC fiber infrastructure for getting this stuff out to the net in a clueful fashion. What do we do then? Well, this model of putting every public briefing online in a place can be replicated at the state level, at the local level, in other capitals. And so I view our mission as putting ourselves out of business as quickly as we can in Washington and selling this bridge back to the government or getting them to take it over, and then taking whatever money we have left or other money we're able to raise and going out and basically trying to teach other people how to do the same thing at the state level, the local level, and in other countries. So replication of this, I think, is a useful thing. Washington's a great place to start because there's so much content there, and the intellectual property issues are really well defined. This stuff is public domain no matter what. It's not quite as clear in a few other instances in some states, and the infrastructure isn't quite as developed. You know, things like the Verizon AVOC isn't there, and, you know, the fiber infrastructure isn't there. But I do think in the long run, if there is a public proceeding happening, I think the public needs to have access to it, both now and forever. If it's a public proceeding, it needs to be archived. Other questions? My radio station, by the way, when I ran it was, I got a call, it was actually called Internet Talk Radio. But I got a call from the New York Times about 1994. And they said, I was putting the Congress online, and they were writing an article. And they said, what's the name of your radio station again? I said, it's RT-FM. Okay. And then I got a call back the next day from the editor, going, what did that stand for again? I was like, I don't believe this. It's Radio Technology for Mankind. And sure enough, they printed it. And so I've been doing business under RTFM for a while. I've got some RTFM stickers up here that are left over. I crashed the United Nations Summit in Tunisia as a member of the media and brought a couple cameras. And so I was actually there under the RTFM rubric. I had an RTFM hat and a little badge and filmed that whole thing. So there's some extra stickers if you folks want. Any more questions? Thank you very much.